to show you how to make bread dough. And many people think that that is such a difficult item to make, but actually it's not. There's a few key points that if you follow them, you will be successful every single time that you make it. And I find that making bread is very rewarding. In fact, today at church we had communion, and the pastor was saying how communion actually means common union. And so many times you sit down with food or you break bread together and you've got that in common. Of course, as Christians, we've got Christ in common. The keys that I have found over the years that help make bread go very well is one, temperature. Pay attention to temperature. When it comes to the yeast, too low would be better than too high. The next thing is the right amount of flour. And if you're incorporating any whole grain flour, I have a little step that I'm going to show you that will help you make sure that you don't add too much flour. Then you need to bake it at the right temperature. Again, there's that temperature. And I had read on King Arthur's website that if the internal temperature of the bread is 200, you know that the bread is finished. The next tip is make sure you cool it on a wire rack. And if you're able to, you know, a lot of times when bread comes out of the oven, you want to eat it right away. But if you're making it to have sandwiches the rest of the week, try not to cut it until it's cooled. Let's go to the kitchen and I'll show you those steps. As you can see, I've gathered my ingredients. Here I have hemp hearts. However, you could use flax meal, oat bran, wheat bran, you could use flax meal. Next, there's molasses, yeast, sugar, oil, salt, soy milk. I'm using soy right now. I think that it makes baked goods richer and softer. And I have two different bowls of flour. This bowl has some white unbleached flour, and this has the whole wheat flour, and then this has unbleached flour that we will add at the second rising. I do find that King Arthur whole wheat flour, in fact all of their flours are at a really good quality. If you find that you are working with a different type of whole wheat and it's not as fine as what this flour is, I recommend that you sift the whole wheat flour, and you would still add the bran back into it, but by sifting it, it makes a lighter, airier product. Also, on the yeast that I'm using, it gives instructions for some proper temperatures. So if you buy a package of yeast, it will probably have those on as well. Or if you are buying this jar, it does have the instructions for proper temperature. The next step is you put your milk, your sugar, your molasses into your soy milk, and then you put your yeast on top of it. Give it a little bit of stir, and we're going to wait about 4 or 5 minutes. It's going to depend on your room temperature, how quickly the yeast proofs or starts to get bubbly. It's been about 5 minutes, and I want you to see how the yeast got. It's bubbly. I'm going to stir it down. While I'm stirring it down, I'm adding the oil. Oil is something that helps make that bread soft and stay fresh. And then I'm adding my salt as well. You of course can always leave salt out, but bread without salt tastes kind of flat and does not have the same flavor. I'm putting in my first group of flour. It's mainly the whole wheat flour, and I'm also putting in hemp hearts, and this would be where if you were substituting flax meal, you would put that in. So you're just going to stir it, get that all combined. And this bread, this is a bread I developed years and years ago when my children were very young. And I was looking for a way to get them used to eating a whole grain bread. And I had actually passed this recipe along to a lot of my friends at Relation League, as they too were trying to incorporate the goodness of whole grains. So in the process, one thing that I learned was that if you add all of the flour at one time, you can often add too much flour and then your bread is crumbly and dry. So this technique, I'm adding about half of the flour, and then I'm going to let it rise until about double. And what that does is it starts letting those whole grains that, you know, if you added bran or hemp hearts, it's letting that absorb all of the liquid that it's going to take on, and then when you add the next batch of flour, you're less likely to add too much flour. So at this point, I give this dough a stir. I make sure that I stir it at least 100 stirs. And when I had little children, we would just practice counting to 100. You can really smell the yeast. And everything mixed really well. I'm coming in right now at about 50 stirs, and you can see that the gluten, the stretchy part of the bread, which is a protein, is starting to develop already. You can also see that some of the liquid is getting absorbed and the dough itself is becoming a little bit thicker. We have finished stirring this the 100 times that I've talked about. And my next step is I'm going to place this over a bowl of warm water. And the water, I took its temperature as well, and it's at about 85 degrees. And you cover it, and we're going to let it rise until double, and then we'll add the remaining flour and prepare it to be baked. I want to show you how I freeze the bread. I have an airtight container. I'm going to let the air out now. This was in my freezer. I just pulled it out to show you. When you're using a container, you will get some frost and moisture on the top, and you don't want that to get on your bread. So when I'm packing the bread, I end with wax paper. I'll slice my bread, and I'll put layers of wax paper between it, and then I can just pull out whatever amount I need, and it will thaw relatively quickly. Of course, you can always toast it. Then I return it to the freezer. I push the air out of my container and just put it back in the freezer till I'm ready to use it again. The other way I wanted to show you about freezing bread is sometimes you buy bread, and again, you're not going to eat it before it starts drying out. So I take a piece of wax paper, I put down the bread, a slice of bread, and I just keep alternating a piece of wax paper and bread. And the wax paper will help the bread not stick together if you want to just get out one slice at a time. And again, I'm going to end with wax paper on top. Then I'll take the bread bag that came in and slip it over the top of those slices. Oh, one of my wax papers from the top came off. Just stick it on there. Then you will just twist the bag shut and put a twist tie or the tie that it came with. At this point, then you can just stick that in your freezer and pull out a slice when you're ready. It's time to add the remaining flour. This took about a half an hour for it to double in size. So I'm going to lift it up off of the water. And I'm actually going to keep my bowl in my sink as I start adding the remaining flour. So I'm going to start with about half of this. This is my second portion of flour, which I measured out. I put 3.5 cups in that bowl, and I just added probably about 1.5 cups. This is where when you let it rise first before adding all of the flour, you'll find it probably won't take all of that 3 to 3.5 cups of flour, because the bran in the whole grains and in your hemp hearts has absorbed a lot of the liquid. That's the technique that will keep you from adding too much flour and will also help keep your bread nice and moist. I'm adding about 1/4 of it. I'm going to scrape the dough off of my spoon, and I'll start working by hand. Eventually we'll be moving to the counter, and beside me, you can't see it, but I have a sink with soapy water to soak that spoon and also to wash my hands if I need to. You can see the dough's not really very sticky. It's pretty good without that amount of flour. I'm kind of kneading it in the bowl for right now, but we will have to move to the counter. The kneading process develops the gluten, and that gives the bread a stretchiness when you start pulling a piece off of a slice. See, I'm working the bread dough down into the bowl, a little bit that was on the side. Scrape that flour up, try to work it in. Okay, it's time to go to the counter now. I'm going to clean off my hands a little bit, and we'll come back on camera shortly. I put the flour down on my counter that was left in my bowl. And now we're going to start the kneading process. So you push it together, pull to yourself, and you're putting the heels of your hands into it. What we're wanting to do is form a nice smooth ball of dough. Now I've got a pretty nice ball of dough here already. Tiny bit sticky, so I'm going to add a little more flour. That's just something you end up getting a feel for. You can see with that little bit of flour, it's starting to pull the bread apart. So I know for sure it needs more kneading time. And usually just count on kneading it for about 5 minutes. Again, I'm getting a little bit of a sticky feel, so I'm putting down a little bit more flour. Just fold it over, bring it towards yourself, put the heels of your hand in it. If you start making bread dough, you'll get your own technique for kneading. And you can see it's not done yet. These are little pieces that are not a ball. Also, I want to be careful not to add too much flour. The whole grains within this are still going to be absorbing some liquid, and that is where you can end up with a dry bread. It's looking pretty nice. Still going to take a little more flour, because see how it's sticking to my hands a little bit. I don't want that. Now it's feeling pretty good. It's not feeling sticky, but it still needs some more kneading time. What I do, so that I don't have to add more flour, is I spray down some Pam. You could just use oil. I spray my hands as well, and then I'm able to continue that kneading process without adding more flour. You can see already the dough's really coming together nicely. I've kneaded the dough for about 5 minutes. It looks great. It has a nice feel to it. What I'm going to do now is put it back into the bowl. I have sprayed it with Pam, and that's so that it doesn't stick to the sides. And then I'm going to spray it again so it doesn't develop a crust, and it will just be free to rise. I'll cover it with a towel, and then I will put it over a bowl of warm water until it doubles. It's been about 35 minutes. The dough is double in size. Now I'm going to gently punch it down just to release some of the air, and I will put it on a floured countertop. Okay, at this point I want you to flatten it out into a rectangle. And today I'm going to make 1 loaf of bread and a few buns. Now this pan that I'm using, this baking sheet, this is 4.5 inches wide by 8.5. You could use a different size, but I just wanted you to see the size that I was using. Now I'm going to cut it in half. So I'm going to use half of it for rolls and half of it for a loaf. I'll get that part out of the way. Turn this in this direction because now I'm going to shape the loaf. I'll get my pan ready, spraying it with Pam. You could use oil or you could use parchment. So just start rolling it, and I'm kind of pulling it back towards myself, trying to make sure that I'm not getting any air bubbles in there. Holding it together, squishing it. So now putting the ends together, and you can see it's shaped like a loaf. Put it in your pan, press it down a little bit. I'm going to brush it with some plant-based milk. Used to be I would use an egg wash, but now I just use some plant-based milk over the top. And lastly, I get a fork and I punch holes in my bread. This is to help get out any air bubbles that might have still been in there. And just pat it down, cover it with a towel, and then it's going to be double in about 30 minutes. Now for shaping the rolls, since I'm going to want them to be about the same size, I'm just going to cut the dough. This will help get them to be similar in size. However, when I have smaller ones or larger ones, I'm okay with that because sometimes I want a smaller sandwich, as does maybe someone I'm serving. These are probably going to end up being slider size. You see how I shape them? Just roll the sides down, and then I kind of roll it in my hand a little bit. We'll be transferring these to a cookie sheet, and I'm lining the cookie sheet with parchment paper. I've transferred the buns to my cookie sheet, and then I push them down. I place them that they're almost touching, and then when they're finished baking, they're probably going to have touched. I also brush these with a plant-based milk. Oh, that one has too much. I'll take it off. I'll just keep going to it to get a little more milk. And then we will cover it with a towel, and these will also rise about a half an hour. The bread has risen very quickly and there was an air bubble in there, and that's what this is. So I'm just going to smooth it out a little bit and just continue baking. In a way, I'm glad that happened, so you see that it doesn't always turn out perfect, but it will still taste awesome. The buns as well are double. They went really quickly. I would say that that was between 15 and 20 minutes. The buns were in the oven for about 20 minutes. I tapped them. They sound hollow. Passed the tapping test. But as I told you at the beginning of the video, I take their temperature and they should be between 195 and 200, and there they are. They're between 195 and 200, so now it's time to put them on the cooling rack. Then you know that they're finished inside, because sometimes the tapping test can be misleading. At this point, I'm going to slide them off the cookie sheet, get them onto a cooling rack as quickly as I can, and I recommend that you wait at least 5 minutes before you eat them because they are so hot. Isaac's going to give us his opinion. What'd you just put on there?
Guacamole.
Is that something you'd like in your lunch?
Yeah, this bread is really good.
I'm surprised you can eat it. It's right out of the oven. Not too hot?
It's still steaming.
Thanks, Isaac. The bread has passed the tapping test, but I'm still taking its temperature. I want to be sure it's between 195 and 200, and there you can see it's 195. It's time to take it out of the pan and get it on a cooling rack. I'm going to loosen it. There you go. It looks excellent. Something else that I want to show you, if you have these old bread pans like this, as soon as it comes out of the oven with a damp cloth, clean it, it just seems to make the pan bake great time and time again. While the bread was still warm, I coated the top with some vegan butter to give it a shine. This is a nice, delicious sandwich bread. It toasts very well. I'm going to move in closer so you can see the nice fine grain that it has. It's moist. It's got just the right texture. Give it a try. I know that you can make bread. Thanks for joining us. Please subscribe.